Good evening, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well today. Hope everyone that is in the KZN area is doing well. There's obviously some hectic storms and rains and expected from tonight. So just keep safe if you are in this region. Okay, so for today, I'm just going to take 10 minutes of our lecture time to just go through the assignment. So just so that everybody is aware in terms of expectations, give you some sort of tips on where to look for things, just so that you can get ahead of it. I do know that it's due next week, so the 19th. So let me just get started because there's quite a bit of content that I actually need to cover today as well. Okay, as goes every week, if you have any questions, just unmute yourself and then ask a question and we'll take it from there. So not going to go over too much on the detail. From a referencing perspective, please make sure that your referencing is done 100% correctly. There will 100% be a Turnitin functionality on ARC. So when you are submitting, you would need to submit it through Turnitin as well, which basically picks up any plagiarism. The use of AI is obviously not wanted. However, there is a specific way that you can reference if you are using something that's AI driven. Maybe it's a graph, something that you had to create for the assignment. I will allow for that. However, it needs to be referenced 100% correctly. If you are unsure, please visit the library. They will be able to help you when it comes to referencing and guide you on the best possible way, whether it's in-text referencing or end referencing. Just make sure that you follow all of the rules and regulations around that. There is obviously penalties applicable if you do have referencing errors. So minor errors are 5% and major errors are 10%. And if there is sort of like inconsistencies, then you will get penalized from that perspective. Okay. There is obviously protocols in terms of your font size, your line spacing, grammar, spelling, sentence construction. I read it quite in depth, so please make sure that your sentence construction is done correctly. Please make sure your spelling, your grammar, all of that is absolutely correct. And I'm not sure if everybody is wanting a sort of assignment template. There is one that the school or the faculty basically has, but I am not rule bound by having to follow it. I want people to show their personalities when it does come to providing or showcasing your own assignment. So definitely a cover page, a table of contents, and then follow through with your assignment. So please make sure that you follow those processes. With the applicable font sizes, line spacing, if you want to use an Arial or a Calibri, whatever you feel comfortable in, you can follow it. The last part on this is just in terms of your word limit. So please make sure that you are submitting it according to your word limit. If it does exceed the word limit, we are basically given instructions to not mark it because it means that you are firstly breaking the rule, and secondly you're trying to give more information and probably you don't have enough juice in the content that you are providing. So just make sure you stick to that. In your assignment specifically, there is a need for word limits, so please take that into account as well. Okay. I'm not going to obviously go through the case study. That is for you to go through. I'm basically just going to go through some of the questions just so that I can give you something that's very high level. I don't want to give you the answers, but it's as high level as I possibly can. So always remember that all of your questions is related to the case study. So there's going to be sort of definitions and an understanding of concept, which you would then need to provide. Please make sure you always provide these definitions and your understanding from a theoretical side. Then you go into an application base. The reason is in the rubrics, in a rubric format, they will always ask you for definitions and from a theoretical perspective, what is the student understanding? So let's take, for instance, question 1.1. Compare and contrast cost leadership and differentiation. You need to now explain what cost leadership is, basically in layman's terms being the cheaper service provider or from a competitor perspective. And then differentiation means having a different product, basically it being unique or sort of personalized. So obviously you need to give more of a textbook related definition. And from there, out of the 15 marks, it'll probably be 2 marks for cost leadership and 2 marks for differentiation. So you don't want to lose out on 4 out of 15 marks already. So make sure you are 100% defining it, okay? So first one, I basically spoke about cost leadership and differentiation. I think it was a first ever lecture. So please go back in with that. It is in the textbook as well, so make sure you go through that. From a supply chain management core functions, we went through this extensively. I think in every single lecture, we speak on efficiency and effectiveness in business and what is part of the core functions with supply chain. We know it's ops, logistics, customer service, those sort of things form part of where supply chain is sitting. Factors that influence the ability of Southern African region to develop regional value chains and supply chains. This sort of information is in the textbook. This is what we went through last week in our lecture. So please just look at it from, we spoke about it from a location perspective, any sort of tariffs or quotas that's there, any restrictions, playing from a global scale market. These are sort of the factors that influence it. So look at it, read it, understand it, and then apply it at the end. And then the last one here is the factors in regional warehouse location. We went through this as well. You need to understand what your transport cost is, what your labor cost is, what your location is talking about. Is it located closer to a highway or a port or an airport? So look at it from that perspective. Question 4, and here's where your essay is coming into play. Write an essay of a minimum of 1,000 and a maximum of 1,200 words. You also need to take into account that there is a rubric that you need to follow. So please make sure you look at the rubric and you can understand where your marks are then sitting, okay? 2 things here which you need to look at is behaviors underlying time series. That's qualitative and quantitative forecasting techniques, which I'm going to go through in today's session. I did put specific focus on time series when we speak about the underlying sort of behaviors as underlying time series, just so that you understand this. So NB on that part. And then the first 5 steps in terms of the purchasing process. I think there's 9 steps in totality, but the question's asking for the first 5 steps. So we're going to go through that from a high level perspective. It's also stuff that is quite common in terms of when you look at it from when you're onboarding a supplier, but we'll go through this when we go through the content. Okay, so that's basically the assignment in a nutshell. I know I spoke about it like it's very simple, but there is obviously a lot of marks that's being allocated towards an application. So please make sure that you are doing that. Is there any questions so far? Okay, yes, Michaela, hi.
Hi, I just wanted to find out, is the word count of 1,200 words, are you including the in-text references and headings, or is that just purely the written work that we are providing?
Honestly, it's going to be on everything, because when we are going to total it, you're not going to take out your in-text referencing. And in-text referencing is very little. You're not putting titles of books and stuff. You're probably putting the main thing is the author and your page number. So I think include it in there. And if you do have headings, it's going to be included as well. So yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, sure. If there's no other questions, I'll start sharing the next bit, which is our actual lecture for today. Okay, so as I mentioned, so today we're going to go over Learning Unit 2, Theme 3, Learning Unit 3, Themes 1 and 2. And the focus is going to be on forecasting, demand planning, and the last one's going to be on procurement or purchasing. And I'm going to try and cover as much as possible in the session because it is two sort of themes that is quite heavily weighted in terms of content, but I want to try and cover just like the basis of it so that at least you understand from an assignment perspective what needs to happen, or at least understand the concepts of it. And then next week we'll go through theme 3. Obviously your assignment sort of stops on theme 2, which is perfect in terms of our timing and the pacer. So we're not going over things that is not necessary for your assignment specifically. Okay, so the first thing is we look at forecasting. All right. And forecasting is basically used in every single business, to be honest with you, whether you are running a business that is purely based on goods, also products, you're forecasting based on historic data, you're forecasting the demand for a specific period in order for you to either increase or reduce production. It's also used from a logistics perspective in terms of resources. What is sort of your average number of, let's say, shipments you want to move in a specific time period based on your customers' movement? Do you need to upscale or downscale in terms of resources, whether it's additional vehicles or increasing working hours, increasing staff, that sort of thing. So it's basically, it allows a lot of businesses in different industries to anticipate sort of trends, any patterns. And we obviously, forecasting is basically completely based on any sort of historic data. You use a lot of statistical models to be able to forecast correctly. And you use some sort of more qualitative or quantitative approaches in terms of, are you going to go with an interview basis where you are, interviewing specific individuals or a specific target market to understand where the demand is sitting for you to forecast, or you're going purely on numbers? So here we're just going to discuss something from a relevance perspective in terms of, what is relevant in terms of forecasting. So the first one is business and strategy planning. So you want to be able to formulate a strategy when it comes to your business and plan better. So it helps a lot of businesses to anticipate and to understand what their future demand is, where your sales is going to be, what your revenue is going to look like, and potentially what are your expenses going to be for that specific time period. So when you're forecasting based on your market trends or your customers' preferences, or just from a competitor perspective, you can make decisions on how to allocate resources differently, how your production needs to happen, whether you need to increase, maybe decrease your pricing, and just like how from an economics perspective works, supply and demand curve. So you need to understand whether your pricing needs to increase because your demand has increased, or maybe you need to reduce your pricing at some point. So you need to understand where you position in the market and what objectives you want to meet, and forecasting then would then speak to this. Okay. The next one is inventory management. So you want to optimize your supply chain as much as possible. So forecasting plays quite a big role in this because you're able to predict what your future demand is for your product, or whether it's a service that you're now providing. So if you provide it optimally, if you basically provide it accurately, you'll be able to optimize as much as possible within your business, whether it's optimizing on stock, maybe it's reducing any excess inventory that you have. Remember, you got cash stuck in inventory, so you don't want to have too much of inventory sitting on the floor without you having to sell it. Then the next one is resource allocation. And just like how we're speaking of strategy planning as well, resource allocation comes into place where you need to understand, what is your utilization levels, how much of resources do you now need to put in, how much of cash flow you now need to inject into the business, how much of investment you now need to, you require in order for you to withstand that forecast. And financial planning, this is completely due to where you want to see your business in terms of future financial projections. You want to understand whether you can set a realistic revenue target, a realistic expense budget. You can have good allocations in terms of capital that you're now putting forward in the business, so that you have sustainability from a financial perspective. Marketing and sales, which is quite integral when you're looking at forecasting, because you want to be able to plan appropriately by predicting any sort of future customer demand. Maybe, your sales performance needs to be at a specific level to run with the different market trends. So marketing does help a lot with this. You need to be able to set realistic sales target, develop any sort of promotional strategies that you have in line with marketing, so that you're reaching a specific target audience, and you can drive revenue from this perspective. Then we have risk management. So it's more from a contingency perspective. So you want to do contingency planning, where you can identify any sort of potential risks within your business, any uncertainty, something that may impact your business either operationally or whether it's from a sales perspective. You want to have a plan when it comes to forecasting to also deal with any agility, and you need to be able to be as resilient as possible so that you can have contingency for unforeseen events or unforeseen circumstances. Tech and innovation. So with tech and innovation, you want to have your forecasting needs to support any sort of strategies that you have from a technology and innovation perspective, whether it is any market opportunities that you see in the future that may come up, maybe a product development, and in order for you to develop this product, you need X technology that you have to import from the UK. So you need to be able to forecast any sort of anticipation for tech advancements. And then you would need to also, I think from a technology and innovation perspective, it's going to help you to stay ahead of the competition, stay ahead of the curve as well, so that you can maintain your competitiveness in the industry that you currently in. And then the last one is government policy. So forecasting basically helps to inform government, especially when it comes to public planning, projection for, any sort of growth or infrastructure or economic trends, so that they can use these sort of models to understand the impact of the investments that they're putting into sort of public or social development, or how they can allocate any sort of resources, whether it's healthcare or education or just like sustainability from a environment perspective. So this is how, forecasting can sit in from a government policy perspective. Okay. So that's basically just to highlight or give you an understanding of what forecasting is a little bit. And these are sort of the three main methods that we look at when we talk about forecasting. Okay, this is something that will pop up definitely in your exams. I can tell you that because it has popped up a few times. But to understand these three methods is not only going to help you now, but it's going to help you in a later stage if you're planning on going further in terms of your education. So if you want to go into a master's level, you are required to do a thesis or a dissertation. When you do a thesis or a dissertation, you are required to use forecasting methods. So whether it's something from a qualitative perspective or a quantitative or hybrid, you are expected to understand what these forecasting methods are, and then expected to use different forecasting techniques when you evaluate it. So the first one is qualitative methods. Okay, so qualitative methods basically is, where you basically relying on opinions, someone who's an expert in a particular industry or field, what is their opinion or their judgment. So it's an expert's opinion, and any sort of qualitative information to predict future outcomes. Okay, so this will mean maybe it's a opinion poll that you have, maybe it's something that is market research related, maybe it is something that is very scenario based, where you're giving your interviewee a scenario and you're asking them to give you their opinion or their advice on it. This is what qualitative basically falls into. From a quantitative side, it's using basically mathematical models, okay, whether it's statistics or quantitative methods, anything from a numerical perspective to predict future outcomes. And this is what qualitative and quantitative is. It's the prediction of any future outcome. When you are doing, let's use an example of a thesis. When you are doing a thesis, you are basically coming up with a concept or a title, and based on that concept or the title, you are taking it to an interview stage or a survey stage to basically ask a specific target group what their opinion is if this subject that you're now speaking about has to be envisioned at some point. And what does it take for it to get to be envisioned? So that's basically what it is. From a quantitative perspective, you use a lot of techniques when it comes to forecasting, like time series and regression, and sort of using different algorithms that can help you to give you an understanding. You're using a lot of historical data, any sort of patterns from a statistics perspective, whether it's a sales forecast or a demand forecast or anything from a numerical or a number perspective. That is what quantitative is. And then hybrid method is basically a combination of the both being qualitative and quantitative, where you're able to leverage the strength of both methods. So it uses sort of subjective judgment or expert opinions from a qualitative side, and it uses statistical models or anything from a numerical side to generate a more accurate or a more reliable forecast. So that's where hybrid now comes into play. Okay. So very simple, very easy. I think just remember it when you're looking at qualitative and quantitative, understand where the number is sitting in. So I would say quantitative for the N, that's where the numerics are sitting, and qualitative is quality in terms of expert opinions, interviews, surveys, etc. And then hybrid obviously being the combination of the both. Okay. Then we move on to forecasting techniques, okay? Let's make this slightly smaller. Okay, so forecasting techniques, one of it being, and this is from a, directly from your forecasting method side, bring it into a forecasting techniques. The first one is time series analysis. So basically what time series analysis is where you're analyzing any historic data to understand patterns or trends or any sort of seasonality over a time period, where it uses a lot in terms of exponential smoothing, any sort of past information, so historic information that you're now trying to bring in with your theoretical side to forecast a future outcome, basically. So from a time series analysis, these are sort of the underlying behaviors. And the first one is trend. So from a trend perspective, you need to understand what within that specific product line or product group that you currently are now trying to push, for instance, is trending at that particular moment. Seasonality is different seasons. So in season, off season, winter, summer, spring, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Valentine's Day, those are all seasonalities, as we call it. From a cycle perspective, it's you now have different cycles when you are moving through, different seasonalities as well. And in terms of, like, an example will be in, let's say, the fashion or textile industry, they have different cycle counts, and the different cycle counts has to do with different seasons. Okay, so a winter cycle, a summer cycle, etc. Irregularity is basically when it's not happening all the time. It's something that happens, time and time again. And then random variation, it's something that you can't predict. It's something that will happen at any stage, basically. Then we have, from a regression perspective. So regression basically examines the relationship between two or more, let's say, variables. So one can be an independent variable, one can be something that's dependent on another variable, so that you can predict also a future outcome. And a lot of times it uses a lot of statistics. So we're talking about, linear graphs or anything that can, influence by multiple factors, like market demand may increase, or consumer behavior may change. Those sort of things can affect, sort of, from a regression analysis perspective. Exponential smoothing, and these things don't pop up very often. Honestly speaking, when you look at forecasting techniques, the most common one that's almost 99% of the time used is your time series, not so much the other techniques. And a lot of times from a method perspective, your quantitative method is used in actually hybrid, I would say. When I did my thesis, I had done it on a hybrid, so both using quantitative as well as qualitative. But time series analysis is one of the techniques that is often used. Then from an exponential perspective, and when you go through this in your textbook, you will see that there is a lot of formulas that's being used when you look at from an exponential perspective. So it's a lot of mathematical calculations where you're able to use historical data to generate your forecast, so that you look at different weights. So how you get a mean, median, mode, where's your regular or irregular pattern sitting at. These are sort of things that you'll use from an exponential smoothing. And then Box-Jenkins basically is a combination of using, different quantitative analysis, like maybe it's something from a exponential smoothing or a regression. It's basically components of different trends to forecast where your future outcome is going to be. So whether it is these, for instance, this Box-Jenkins model is basically used for looking at weather patterns, for instance, or whether the interest rate is going to increase or decrease, or inflation is going to increase or decrease. So basically financial patterns. So that's where you would use to forecast these sort of things. Okay, then we move on to cloud-based forecasting. And when we have to, let's bring this down a little bit more. So the use of basically cloud-based forecasting has a lot of advantages, okay? It basically allows for businesses, especially if you're seeking something that's more efficient or scalable, or something that's a little bit more collaborative in terms of forecasting solution. Some of them opt for cloud-based forecasting. So the first one is from an accessibility perspective. You can use it anywhere and anytime. It's basically forecasting tools used in conjunction with the data that is available through, whether it is a mobile application or a web browser. Basically, if it is something that is required from a real-time update, or something that's on the go, something that you need to make a quick decision with, it allows you to forecast the information that is readily available and accessible, so that you are able to then make a decision. Okay. From a scalability side and also resource efficiency perspective, it can be especially when you're leveraging off a cloud infrastructure. So cloud-based, you can understand it is something that is using or generating historic data and now creating a forecast based on that, but it's completely using different tools and techniques that is built into the forecasting tool to now spit out the information that you require. So when it's scalable, you're able to accommodate for more data volumes, whether it's a huge increase in an historic data perspective or whether your present data is now increased. You can scale it up or scale it down, whether you have on this specific cloud-based forecasting 2 users and you now, are now needing to scale it up to 10 users, you can apply, more resources to this. It does allow for user requirements to be increased. Then we have cost savings. It basically eliminates the need for having something that's on site in terms of a hardware or anything that's going to help, where you have to purchase, hard equipment. Or any sort of like maintenance costs when you have traditional forecasting systems. So you're able to, especially with cloud-based, it probably be subscription-based models. You pay per time that you're using it. If you are having sort of budget constraints, it will fall within a specific budget that doesn't increase or decrease. So you're able to still, those are sort of the benefits of it. I'm not going to go too much into this, but from a collaboration perspective, you're able to use, multiple users can collaborate with it. You're able to share a lot of insights, share some data, use real time. If you're on the go and you need to make, as I said, a quick decision, you're able to then do that. So I'm just going to let you read through a lot of this because I don't think we have too much of time and we obviously still have to go through some of our purchasing stuff. Okay, and then I'm going to go through demand planning, okay? So demand planning, obviously quite a critical aspect when it comes to supply chain management. It uses a lot of forecasting in order for you to understand what the future trend from a customer demand is going to be for your product or your service. So you need to understand how, from a business perspective, they use demand planning, whether it's a specific tool or the process or what technique they use to optimize the inventory management, or whether it's scheduling their production or just allocating a specific resource to a specific task. How do they then, use this demand planning technique? So the first one is you want to be able to forecast demand. And demand planning begins with you firstly forecasting for future demand, which is based on anything that's historic. So a business can use, whether it is a time series analysis or whether it's different algorithms to generate accurate and reliable demand forecasts. Whether you are introducing a new product line, whether the market is changing, whether there's a time horizon that's now changing, you can then plan for your demand a lot better by forecasting it. Inventory management. So demand planning itself guides inventory management, especially the decisions behind inventory management. You need to understand whether you have optimal inventory levels, whether you have enough safety stock on your shelf, what is your reorder process, based on what your forecasted demand is going to be. So by aligning your inventory level or your inventory management per se, with your forecasted demand, with your demand planning, you can minimize as much from a stock out perspective. The worst thing that you want is a customer putting through orders, so demanding a product, and you now don't have any inventory or stock to now supply them. You also don't want too much of stock because you've got no money sitting in the stock, and you don't want to carry a lot of cost over in terms of having obsolete goods. So you also, if your product has an expiration date, for instance, you don't want to be having excess of stock and then it becoming obsolete and you're now having to destroy it. That's your money that you're basically burning away. Then we have production planning and scheduling. So demand planning itself informs production planning and scheduling, because it's now translating all of your demand forecasting into actual production plans, into actual schedules, what material is then required for the production, and what capacity you can produce. So that's where production planning would come into play. You want to be able to align your production schedule with your demand planning so that you can have efficiency in your production plan. You want to be able to reduce as much lead time as possible. So understand how long it takes you from order to manufacturing, or to order to production to distribution. And also minimize as much bottlenecks as possible. So you don't want to reach a point of where you are producing a product up to a certain space and then up to a certain place and then it becomes a bottleneck. You want to be able to meet your customer's demand at the time that you're now promising that you're going to get it to them. Then the next one is having a new product introduction, and let's go to supply chain optimization. So demand planning obviously contributes towards supply chain optimization, because you want to synchronize your supply and demand across the entire value chain. So when you do economics as well, they'll teach you exactly this. So you want to be able to, in your value chain itself, have your supplier, your manufacturer, your distributor, your retailer, your logistics party, whoever they are, everyone being synchronized and collaborating as much as possible. So you want to be able to share your demand forecast and collaborate with all of your different partners in your value chain so that you can coordinate a little bit better. You can have a very responsive supply chain. You want to reduce your disruptions as much as possible so that you have an overall, supply chain increase in performance. So that's where you want to see yourself, and demand planning helps you. It's always nice when you are planning for X demand, you are sharing it with your value chain partners. So whether, for instance, I can give you as much examples from a logistics perspective, but if I know a customer's planning a 20% or a 30% increase in demand from them, which is obviously going to translate into actual shipments that is going to be moved, I then can plan myself from a logistics perspective on, I need X vehicles, I need X resources in terms of labor. The expectation of delivery is, 1 to 2 days or 3 to 4 days. I'm setting a realistic expectation from a logistics perspective to the customer. So when demand planning does happen from the core of the business within their supply chain, it's always nice to bring in all of the parties so everybody works together like a bike. Okay, it just moves. Then the next one is new product introduction. So we want to understand from a new product perspective, the sort of the lifestyle of it, or the life cycle of it. So when you're forecasting for new products, we want to understand how we're phasing out maybe older products, or how we're managing the transition when there's a new product. So whether the market or the customer is going to accept the product or not, what is their preferences, that sort of thing. So demand planning does help because it facilitates a lot of the new product introduction into the market. Promotional planning and pricing. So from a demand planning side, it supports promotional planning and pricing strategies, because you can forecast how the impact of, if you are splashing out on marketing, obviously promos, those sort of pricing changes, everything will be marketed in a specific way. So what is the impact of that on your customer demand as well as on your sales volume? So you need to obviously integrate the demand forecast with any sort of marketing plan that happens, or different pricing strategies, because the more customers buy into that, the increase in demand it then becomes, which then speaks to production, it speaks to distribution, it speaks to the end customer. Then we have customer relationship management. And it basically, demand planning enhances your customer relationship management efforts because you need to align your supply chain operations with the customer's demand. What is the customer's preferences? What is their expectation in terms of service levels? So you need to have different customer segmentation, understanding what the order history is, that sort of thing. So you need to understand your customer fully in order for you to plan, so that if you do get an increase in demand, you're able to then schedule it properly, distribute it accordingly, etc. And then the last one is continuous improvement and also monitoring in terms of performance. So you want to be able to, from a demand planning side, involve both of this, whether it's continuous improvement and performance monitoring, because you want to understand whether you have an accurate forecast or your forecast is as accurate as possible. What is your KPI, so your key performance indicators? What did you set out in terms of when you were planning for your demand or forecasting for it? What was the KPIs you set into place? Can you now tick box it? Whether it is inventory turnover ratio, whether you look at it from a time series where it's different seasonalities, different trends, what was regular, irregular, that sort of thing. What is the next level from an improvement perspective? You can then easily identify what's your improvement strategy, so you can now redefine your forecasting models or redefine your forecasting techniques, so it then becomes better over time. So taking into account fully from a demand planning and even from a forecasting perspective, you want to understand that the main reason for forecasting and planning for an increase in demand speaks to you wanting an optimization in your supply chain. You want to be able to forecast your demand, do your inventory management, optimize your supply chain, do all of this so that at the end of the day, you are getting more agility. You're making your supply chain a lot more efficient. You're making it responsive to your customer demand, so that you're driving business success at the end of the day. And I think that's where the key is nobody wants to go into business completely blind. You want to be able to have historic data and then forecast for the next. And that's how budgets are done as well. You look at last year, add on, slap on 10, 20%, whatever it is, and there's your budget for the new year. So that's basically what forecasting is in a nutshell. Okay. Then we move on to something called CPFR, okay, which is collaborative planning, forecasting, and replenishment. Okay, so collaborative planning, forecasting, replenishment. Basically, this is a business practice that some businesses use that allows for collaboration amongst their different trading partners in their value chain to improve their demand forecast, to make it as accurate as possible, to optimize your inventory level, and basically give you an efficient supply chain. So the first thing you want to do is improve your forecast accuracy. And by doing this, basically CPFR facilitates collaborative forecasting because you're now sharing your data, any sort of business intelligence that you have amongst all of your partners, whether it is your supplier, your distributor, your manufacturer, your producer, whoever it is, you're now sharing your sort of data with these individuals. So when you're pulling together all of these resources and all of this expertise, you can make a decision of a more accurate demand forecast so that you can understand your customers' preferences a little bit more, and you can have accuracy, which in turn actually saves you money, The next one is you want to optimize your inventory level. So CPFR specifically allows for businesses to synchronize their inventory level with their forecasted demand. So also by collaboration with the different partners, you want to align your policies from an inventory side. What is your safety stock level? what is your replenishment schedule, etc., with different partners, so that you can have a cash flow efficiency, you can have any sort of risk that you have mitigated as much as possible. And then you want to reduce your cycle time. So reduction in cycle time basically streamlines your supply chain operations. You want to reduce your lead time, because you want to improve your demand visibility. So you need to be able to communicate and coordinate between all of the trading partners, so that you can respond quickly if a customer has a change in demand. Today, a customer likes something, tomorrow they don't. How do you then respond to it? How does your trading partners then respond to it? So it's understanding it from that perspective and collaborating with the different trading partners. Okay, so that's CPFR in a nutshell. All right, then we go on to purchasing and procurement, okay? And from a purchasing and procurement perspective, we want to understand what the difference is between the two. So purchasing specifically is the transactional process. So that is exchange of money, or the process of buying a good or a service from a supplier so that you can meet a direct operational need. It basically is, let's say the process is you're placing an order, you're negotiating a price, you're managing a relationship with the customer. So you're basically focusing on executing individual transactions within a specific parameter, okay? Then we have procurement, which procurement is a broader set of activities basically involved in acquiring goods and services, so in which you support your business's goals and objectives. It is, you basically, from a procurement perspective, involves whether it's strategic planning with a supplier, maybe it's supplier selection process. I mean, some businesses, it can be as grueling as, giving them your blood type, maybe it's contract negotiation. They need to be able to provide you with something from a risk management. So we call it a BCP, so business continuity plan. If something has to happen to their business, what is a continuation plan? Or if they have to lose 2 routes, for instance, or one machine goes down, what is the BCP? And then also look at it from a supplier performance management side. So they obviously will set KPIs, and based on the KPIs that's set, you then run it or manage the supplier. So that's basically in a nutshell what purchasing and procurement is. I'll leave you to read a little bit more on the both of that as you go along. So we talk about why procurement is so important, and I'll run through it very quickly. So the first thing is cost reduction and savings. Every business wants to save as much in terms of cost as possible, and procurement plays a huge role in the cost reduction perspective. So a lot of procurement managers are actually incentivized by having cost reduction strategies in place. It's then dictated by a rand value or a percentage, and based on that, they then get incentivized or get bonuses. So they want to optimize their sourcing strategy. They want to be able to negotiate whether it's a favorable term, maybe it's a 60-day or a 90-day, depending on that business cash flow. And you want to leverage as much economies of scale with the supplier as possible. So try and keep all your eggs in one basket. The more volume you have, the lower price the supplier then gives you. So that's where procurement comes into play. You also have, from a supply chain efficiency perspective, they are almost 99% of the time, from a procurement perspective, involved in making sure that there's an efficient supply chain running. So whether your raw materials or semi-finished good or even your service is delivered on time, how can you best optimize inventory levels? How can you minimize as much disruption in your supply chain as possible? And a lot of time they hold or are part owner or majority holder in your supply chain, because they are dealing with all of your suppliers whether it's from a production perspective, a supplier perspective, or even a distributor perspective. Then we have innovation and value creation. So procurement basically drives innovation because they basically hold the strategic partnerships with suppliers. So promoting any sort of collaboration with the supplier or integrating the supplier into the business's supply chain. Any new technology that comes into play from a supplier perspective or the supplier's competitor or their own competitor, the procurement department sort of knows about it. So that's why they drive a lot of that innovation. CSR, which we know is corporate social responsibility. So they want to promote as much from a sustainability perspective, whether it's getting suppliers that is environmentally responsible or following a specific ethical labor practice, anything from a sustainability that can be involved in the supply chain initiatives does help. A lot of times as well, Triple BE functions within the procurement department itself, so that also speaks a lot. Then we have quality and compliance. There's obviously a lot of regulatory requirements when it comes to quality and compliance of a different product. So you have to be able to select reputable suppliers or reputable distributors, whatever it is, to make sure that you have quality assurance in your supply chain. So when you have a strategic procurement process, they prioritize this in terms of your supplier evaluation. Then we have risk management and resilience. So procurement manages the risk. They try and be as resilient as possible by identifying any potential risks in the supply chain as early as possible so they can drive any mitigation strategy. And sometimes they do this by diversifying the supplier base. So as much as they want economies of scale with one supply, they're always keeping a second and third supplier on board. So if there's a risk with one, they can fall back on number 2 and number 3. And then the last one is strategic alignment. So procurement obviously aligns with what the business's goals and the objectives are, because you now have different procurement strategies that you bring into the value chain. So they try and prioritize that as much as possible and align this with, what the procurement goals and objectives are to what the business's goals and objectives are. And that's basically why procurement is so important. And I think a lot of it is very self-explanatory when you look at, from a procurement perspective, what their role and responsibility is within the supply chain and how collaborative they need to be with a specific supplier. Okay. Then we go into different purchasing processes, if I want to call it that. So the first one is centralized purchasing. And from a centralized purchasing, you basically want to use the different types of purchasing, whether it's centralized purchasing or decentralized or even a hybrid purchasing approach, to make strategic decisions on how a lot of your procurement activities are managed within the business. So each approach, whether it's the 3 that I mentioned, each have their own advantages, their disadvantages, so all the pros and cons of it. But you need to understand what works well for your business and what can make the procurement process as effective and as efficient as possible. So the first one being centralized purchasing. And this is basically any sort of purchasing activity that is consolidated and you manage it from a central point or a central department or a central team within the business. So all the purchasing decisions, everything from a negotiation, a supplier relationship, any strategic collaboration, everything is coordinated centrally. And it's based on like a standardized procurement policy or procedure or a specific guideline, but everything is run through one department. So one of the advantages of this is you have economies of scale because everything is now being pushed through one specific department. So you end up with better pricing strategies from your supplier, etc. The disadvantage is you have a lack of flexibility and responsiveness to what the other departments want. So for instance, to give you an example, and again from a logistics perspective, you have a business that runs, let's say they have 4 different branches of that business in Durban, Cape Town, Pretoria, and Johannesburg, right? Each sort of region is basically molded differently. And if you want to move, let's say, your product on a specific logistics channel and a specific route, to follow it from a centralized perspective sometimes always doesn't work. So someone in Joburg, let's say that's where head office is sitting, they make the decision to use company X to move all of their products nationally. Advantage, yes, economies of scale, you get better pricing, but someone sitting in Cape Town may not feel as though all the products running locally. So let's say Cape Town, Stellenbosch, George, Port Elizabeth, this particular supplier doesn't have the reach to give you better lead times. So it's better for a decentralized purchasing in that perspective, where they can get somebody that's sitting in Cape Town to basically run with that network. So yes, that's the basically advantages and disadvantages. Decentralized is basically where it's managed in individual departments or different locations within the business. So each basically branch or unit has a right to make their own decision when it comes to any purchasing decisions and to negotiate the contract. The business is not hell-bent on saying you're required to use X, Y, and Z. So I'll tell you specifically, like in my branch, so there's facilities management. So our head office in Johannesburg told us that we needed to use a specific facilities management company if it came through to plumbing or maintenance or electrical, etc. We had to only go through one company. And this, from a procurement perspective, made sense for them because they obviously negotiated certain terms with the supplier. When it came to, let's say, a toilet getting blocked, for instance, I had to now put in a call to this company that head office had chosen. They had to now find a supplier that was based in Durban, which is not all the time them. They are sometimes outsourcing it to a third party. They had to now get hold of the third party. The third party then takes a full day to now come to me, analyze what my problem is, and then give me a quote, and then, finally solve the problem. Whereas if I have my own supplier on my books, I can call him directly, say, hey, I've got a problem. Please, can you come in like the next 20 minutes? Yeah, sure, no problem. He's there, analyzes on my problem and gives me a quote and sorts the issue out. And majority of the time, your local-based supplier is a lot cheaper than when you have a centralized option. Okay. So one of the advantages is local knowledge of the market and supply capabilities. So more or less the example what I just gave you. And the disadvantage is duplication of efforts can be basically fragmented supplier relationships with higher costs, which is exactly what happened. So we were using a big brand company to do facilities management, much higher costs. And they're also outsourcing a lot of their business because they're not always situated in the same region. And then the last one here is hybrid purchasing. And from a hybrid purchasing perspective, it's a combination of both, which is actually not so bad because you have a little bit of standardization. You have, where some functionalities or categories can be centralized, some can be decentralized based on what is morally more important or what's more complex or what is the business's requirements, etc. So one of the advantages here is you have your risk mitigation because, when it comes to centralized procurement, whereas decentralized, you have, you're balancing the control. So you want to get your supplier in as quickly as possible at a cheaper rate. Yes, that's a decentralized option. And then risk mitigation because you're now dealing with one supplier from a head office perspective. The disadvantage is complexity with managing multiple model system. You're obviously dealing with a lot of different suppliers, requires different communication, different sort of changes. Okay, And then the last one, which is part of your assignment, is your purchasing process and your steps. I know we don't have a lot of time, but basically this is your different steps when it comes to the purchasing process. So the first one is developing and describing a need. Okay, so that's basically understanding what you need a supplier for, what is the different process that they would have to go through, etc. You then have a list of supplier or suppliers that you need to choose from based on what their need is. So let's say it's a plumbing need. You need to understand whether it is toilets or showers or whatever it is. Who's your suppliers? Maybe 1, 2, or 3 suppliers. You now need to have a list of them. Understand where they're sitting at from a pricing perspective. How quickly can they now respond to you? And then you rank them from cheapest to basically more expensive. What is their ordering process? How can you now place an order? How quickly can they now come out to you, etc. And then following up and expediting. So I know that it asks for 5 steps, but the 6th step is when you get your product, when you receive it, how to expect it, and then distribute it. So what is the sort of then your sources for it is having the correct documentation, whether it's a delivery note or an inspection report, etc. How do you now do returns, handle any sort of rejections? How do you then make payment, and then you close the order? So especially if you're working with different purchasing systems like SAP or Reba, what is the process when you now need to make a purchase specifically? And that's basically the purchasing process step. Okay, so one thing from all of this, when you're doing your assignment, okay, 2 things. The first one is definitions. Please add it in there. I've seen countless of assignments where people just try and do application and they lose out on genuine marks that they should be getting. And number 2, apply. Use the case study and apply your theory to the case study. That's my 2 sets of advice for the assignment that's coming up. Any questions? I assume nothing. Okay. Reminder, ICE task is due tonight at midnight, so just before a minute before midnight. And your assignment's due next week. But I'll chat to you guys next week. Thank you so much. Have a fantastic weekend and rest of your Thursday.